Hello, everyone. This is Pradeep Padala, co-founder CEO at Filament. Today, I have a very good friend, VP of Cloud Engineering at Snowflake, Justin Fitzhugh, with me. We're going to talk about core at Snowflake and how core applies in various areas at Snowflake or in general. Justin, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Pretty great to be here, and appreciate you having me today on such an interesting topic. My name is Justin Fitzhugh. I run a group called Cloud Engineering. I'm vice president of Cloud Engineering, and what we're
Mhm.
responsible for at Snowflake is really interacting with the cloud providers and the technical infrastructure. So we handle everything from automating the instantiation of VPCs, of various networks, of the infrastructure. We manage that. We manage parts of the security, observability. We do quite a bit of kind of support and help. We build out kind of a container platform where we deploy various applications. So really anything to do with the technical infrastructure and the automation and platforms around that is what we're working on at Snowflake.
Tell us a little bit about your team at Snowflake, Justin. What is the size of the team? What kind of skills you have in your cloud engineering team?
Sure. So the cloud engineering team is growing pretty rapidly. Right now, we're right around a little over 60 people, but we're looking to double that in the next probably 12 months, aggressively hiring.
Hmm.
And we're made up about 75% of kind of engineers with more of a software background. So we're looking for engineers who are developing software, developing tools, developing automations, ways to kind of connect various tools and really build a platform to run our technical infrastructure on. With the other part in other areas such as security and some operational side of things, but really focusing on kind of the engineering, software engineering side. We're a part of the overall engineering organization.
Hmm.
Um, we kind of split up into a few different functions. One is our kind of production engineering, where we're focused engineering wide on stability, reliability, and architecture. We have a platform team that's focused on building a container platform, kind of an orchestration team that's focused on building our tooling around how do we instantiate infrastructure, a production security team that's really focused on how do we secure our cloud environment as well as our application deployments and such. And then some
Hmm.
various other kind of supporting functions around supporting the various technologies and applications that Snowflake runs.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a sizable team with very very different skills required in cloud engineering. So, Justin, to talk about some of the challenges that we face in cloud engineering, what do you see as the biggest pain point that you see in your team or your team is facing or in your cloud infrastructure?
Sure, I think we've gone through and continue to go through pretty rapid scale and growth. And when you start
Hmm.
to exponentially scale your infrastructure, you certainly can't exponentially scale humans or people to support it. And so
That's
we've
right.
really made kind of a shift towards how are we going to engineer a platform, how are we going to engineer infrastructure tooling around how to instantiate and manage that infrastructure as opposed to manually instantiating it or operating it. So it's a shift from operations to
Hmm.
engineering. And so that shift is one that we're in the midst of and we made good progress on. But I think to do this, you start to build up a lot of various tools and a lot of to do point solutions. So you may have various cloud. We operate on three public clouds: Azure, Amazon, and GCP. And so you have different
Hmm.
APIs on each of those. And then we have things like Ansible. We use Terraform. We use Pulumi. We obviously have Slack. We use Jira. We have PagerDuty. We have a bunch of different tools. And what you find
Hmm.
is a lot of automation in each one of these pockets, but how do you tie all that together into a workflow or a business process? And how do you think about kind of that whole workflow from instantiation to management to if there are issues to kind of how do you report it, how do you alert on it, and so that workflow is definitely a piece that's a pain for us in terms of how do we continue to scale, like I said, at these exponential ways and managing very large amounts of
Hmm.
infrastructure across a diverse kind of cloud platform.
What are some of the biggest outages or problems you have seen in your infrastructure? So it looks like there are quite a few tools that are used in solving these problems. What do you see as the rough workflow that you would follow when an outage happens?
Yeah, in almost all of the, I wouldn't say absolutely everyone, but I'd say in a large
Hmm.
majority, the outages that we've seen can be traced back to either multiple failures happening where you didn't plan for kind of redundancy amongst a dual or triple failure. But more
Hmm.
often than not, it's traced back to some kind of human error. So we've seen cases where perhaps something isn't tested appropriately or a test isn't written correctly, and as it moves through to production, we don't find that until it gets there. Or something is incorrectly applied in mass
Hmm.
across the environment as opposed to rolled out, or an engineer makes an assumption that's incorrect. And so that's where we see honestly, when we don't touch systems, when systems are allowed to operate in their more or less autonomous mode, and I've seen this across multiple
Hmm.
different organizations, they're pretty stable. It's the change
Yeah.
that often causes these issues, and so it's about how do you manage, and how do you manage that change at an appropriate pace, and how do you put those controls in place. And that's really where we're looking at from an automation perspective of how do we make every change to our infrastructure look like a code commit, and have an appropriate testing behind it, and having approval
Hmm.
flows, and actually having kind of a CD pipeline to push those changes out, and not having any kind of manual changes applied. Now it's a panacea on where we're getting to, but I think that's the philosophy that we're operating on, based on a lot of these outages that we've kind of seen in the past.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So you see infrastructure as code and immutable infrastructure. These kind of paradigms help you a lot. You're absolutely right that if you don't make any change to a relatively stable system, you can continue to run for a while. And I've seen it in my experience as well in the past. But change is always constant because obviously Snowflake is growing, and I don't know if you can you talk a little bit about the scale of number of transactions or the kind of things that you're handling day to day in your infrastructure.
Yeah, I don't have hard numbers to to get you from. I'd have to go talk
Uh-huh.
to my marketing department.
But
But
roughly, I
I think
guess
in
number
terms of,
of.
yeah, I mean, we're doing billions of queries, and we're doing very large amounts of infrastructure. Kind of our the numbers we're talking about with the large cloud providers are fairly public, but we're doing
Mhm.
many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of kind of infrastructure um, elements, I'd say, and we're one of the larger consumers of AWS and other cloud providers. And we definitely find that we push them to their limits in a lot of cases, where they're designing systems around our workloads versus kind of us
Mhm.
blindly using their infrastructure. And we have to think about this as a lot of people look at public cloud as this great place where it's infinitely scalable. But at the end of the day, it is a data center. It does have physical constraints, and so we're large enough that we're pushing those constraints with the public cloud providers, where we really need to kind of work with them, and partner with them, which we've had great success with on all three platforms.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you mentioned about using all these different tools, PagerDuty for incident management, Slack for collaboration, Datadog and other tools for monitoring. How do you see all this coming together? We've been talking about a concept called COAR, cloud orchestration, automation, and remediation, or putting all these different tools together. There are various tools like PagerDuty, Datadog, Slack, and others. What do you think of core and the concept of it, and how do you see it being applied at Snowflake?
Yeah, it's interesting because as we started down this path, I'd say probably a little over a year ago, we started to see exactly this problem, but we didn't necessarily have a name
Hmm.
for it. Where we continued
Right.
to see lots of pockets of automation, or pockets of or APIs, and there was no way to kind of orchestrate them. And the core concept is really interesting because I think it's uniquely applicable for kind of cloud environments, because everything is
Hmm.
being done through an API. There's no person to go down and work on a data center, or plug in a patch cable. That's done through an API. And everything is being done through some kind of API or some kind of tool. So as we started to continue to scale the infrastructure, we found that we started to have this sprawling set of tools, but they weren't necessarily, how do you integrate one to the other? For example, how do you integrate an Amazon API with maybe a Terraform run with some Ansible, and how do you make sure kind of the data that is output in terms of the results is now correctly formatted and inputted into the next tool, and making sure that you're doing validation at each one of these steps, and reporting out via various tools such as, like you said, Slack, Jira. I mean, there's tons of them. How do you
Hmm.
integrate in as you roll these tools, these workflows out, how are you looking at your monitoring systems to understand what's happening? Do you have a successful rollout? Do you have an issue with the rollout? And how do you bring that all into one out? Historically, that's been a person that's kind of looked at various wiki pages and looked at these processes and tried to bring it all together. And for us, that just didn't scale. And I think if you look at how infrastructures are built at even large organizations, you look at Google, you look at Facebook, you look at some of these, they've kind of seen this, they understand this, and they've started to build systems without having a name for it. But I think that, as we discuss COAR, it's really a need that we have as we build kind of the technical infrastructure on how do we bring all these tools together, how do we standardize, kind of how do they fit, and how do they operate in concert into kind of a consistent to achieve a business outcome. And when I say business outcome, I mean we need to spin up a new instance of Snowflake, right? Like, yes, that's technical, but there is a business outcome from it. And then how do we plug the various technical pieces in to achieve that? And so that's really what COAR is about, I think, is how do you orchestrate all these tools together and come out with a with kind of the business or technical result, but really kind of that business outcome that you're looking for. And so I think it describes a problem very well that we were feeling and didn't quite have a way to put our finger on a name. And so it illustrates exactly the issue that we've been seeing. So, yeah.
Yeah. So do you have a code or like a bunch of tools that you guys have built inside internal to Snowflake that does this, like putting it all together? Like, do you have something at your in your team?
Yeah, so we started again, as we've talked about, we started to make a transition from kind of what you would traditionally call a DevOps organization, more towards kind of an engineering organization that's building tooling, building the platform. And as we did that very early on, we found the need for this orchestration, and we actually have made really good progress on building kind of a framework to help bring all these tools together and do this orchestration. Which we built internally. We're going through the evaluation phases right now of how could we open source it, how could we leverage it with leverage the community, and because I believe that we're not the only ones to have this problem. I do believe often you need to get to some scale before you really feel this. But I think once you get to kind of a medium scale of an organization or technical infrastructure, you start to feel this. So we've started to build a framework. We've tried to actually keep it fairly. Our original use case for why we were building this was to create instances of Snowflake in a very automated way and very repeatable way. But what we found is we've actually found a lot of other use cases that could benefit from this in terms of how do we do rollouts, how do we do releases, how do we manage change in the infrastructure, and having kind of this generic framework that helps do the orchestration of all these tools and does a lot of validation at each step has really been great. And we're starting to see actually pretty broad adoption. The other piece is it allows us to modularize a lot of these steps. And so we can say, for example, you have to do a setup of a set of HSMs, or you have to do a setup of a particular VPC in a specific way. We can modularize that. We can create a module for that and let those development teams develop that and plug into an overarching framework. So it allows us to get parallelism and distribute the work out to the engineers who may be working on one specific part, but plug into a framework where we can leverage it and put the building blocks together into different workflows and such.
What do you see as a typical workflow, or what are the different steps that in general your team would take in a platform or in a project like that you guys have built?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a really good use case is kind of how do we instantiate like a new instance of Snowflake. We have them in different regions. We have private Snowflakes. We have more multi-tenant Snowflakes. And for us, there's a lot of different steps. And it's interesting because building the technical infrastructure or the cloud infrastructure is sometimes the easiest part. We have to know things, what region we have to. So we kind of have to have a set of information to bootstrap it. Then we have to build up that base environment. We actually have to work with 5 or 6 different teams around. Once the base infrastructure is there, how do we load keys into HSM? How do we deal with private keys? How do we bootstrap that? How do we start to load customer information and access into it? So it goes from instantiate with, say, a cloud provider to maybe some Ansible runs to maybe another set of data that comes in, or a validation, and then security obviously has a set of tests that they run against it to validate that everything's been set up appropriately. And so that has to be built into the process, along with kind of status updates along the way. there sometimes are the way we bootstrap specific storage accounts is something that has to be done from compliance reasons separately, like from somebody separate from who's setting up the main instance, so we don't have a single person who has complete access to a deployment. All the way through, how do we do QA at the end? How do we test to ensure the deployment is ready and to the level that nothing's been missed, or the security controls are all in place and the quality controls and capacity is all where we expect it to be. So
Mhm.
those, if you look at that, there's a whole bunch of different things that a bunch of tools that we need to kind of make that workflow happen, including human processes where humans may need to approve for some reason. So how do we automate that? And how do we make sure that we're moving to that next step immediately upon approval, and we're validating a lot of those steps in between and such. So that's where we found the frameworks to be really interesting. We've also seen quite a few where when you start to look at kind of production incidents, how can we build workflows around remediating? So immediately say you have a resource utilization issue or something where you can immediately do some workflow that may be some combination of cloud APIs or actually issuing an API command to a specific server or looking in logs and bring all that data back so that you kind of have immediate data and can evaluate the situation and have automated actions that an operator can either take automatically or can click on. That's another use case that we're looking at in terms of how do we kind of automate and
Mhm.
quicken that response to kind of incidents. And so that's how we kind of get to this orchestration all the way through to kind of response side of things.
Mhm. So it looks like you have all the pieces of orchestration, deployment, and continuous deployment, and then the automation of many of these pieces, which are done through scripts, Terraform, Pulumi, and other tools. And finally, remediation. When a problem happens, you mentioned resource utilization issue, then there is a specific action taken, and that may be automated as well. So you see all these things coming together.
That's right.
Is that how you see as a core as?
No, and that's exactly where that to me is how we define core. And like I said, I think we came to the nomenclature of core kind of through a need, and the need is
Right.
that you can't have. We found many issues with having humans operate and not having kind of a orchestration to bring all these together. And so that's exactly kind of what I think defines the need and why core is kind of important for us in the industry.
It's awesome, Justin. So I have just one final question. So for other cloud engineering teams, cloud engineering leaders, or cloud engineers, what advice would you give when they're getting started with new cloud infrastructure deployments, automation, remediation, all the aspects of cloud engineering? What is your advice to them?
Yeah, so my advice is, start from the beginning thinking about cloud engineering or DevOps or SRE, whatever you may call it, as an engineering organization, not as an operations organization. Because
Hmm.
what I don't, I think that any type of scale, even if it's not significant kind of growth from a quality perspective, that almost trumps even the ability to scale, which is anytime you have a reproducible artifact that's being produced via code as opposed to kind of a human or a set of manual tasks, you're going to have much better results. And you're going to have, if you have workflows and processes and gates and such that are all automated, you're going to have a much better result from a quality perspective. And so it's interesting because we looked at kind of the software we're building kind of in the core concept, and we said, I kept getting questions of, how much time is this going to shave off our deployment time? And while that's interesting, I
Hmm.
think that's actually secondary to, hey, how can we build 20 or 100 of these all at the same time and have them all come out exactly the same with 100% quality? That to me is
Yep.
actually the more important question. And so, if you want to answer that second question, you really have to build engineering teams that are building software and tooling, as opposed to how many people can we hire to run a set of steps that may be outlined somewhere. And so, my biggest advice
Yep.
is continue to think about as an engineering team. Sure, there are some operational components, but focus on the engineering side. How are you building tooling? How are you making developers' life easy by giving them self-service automated platforms, as opposed to trying to use human manpower to kind of to influence that. And that's where I would focus.
Yeah, that's great advice, Justin. I think that's very relevant, and it's true that it's not about just thinking of it as like having people manage infrastructure. It's more about coding the infrastructure through engineering
Exactly.
and through with good software practices. So that's pretty much it, Justin. Thanks a lot for joining us. This has
Of course.
been great talking about core and core at Snowflake. Any final comments?
No, I think we're really excited about CORE and about kind of the community that we're building here. Continue to look for hopefully some announcements as we work through our
Yeah.
processes that we can start to collaborate with the community. But very excited and yeah, look forward to continuing to build the CORE community going forward.